and high-heeled sandals made it look more like a shop window dummy or a stylish young woman about town. Momo stared at it, fascinated. After a while she put out her hand and touched it. Instantly the doll blinked a couple of times, opened its rosebud mouth, and said in a metallic voice that sounded as if it were issuing from a telephone,
"Hello, I am Lola, the living doll."
Momo jumped back in alarm. Then automatically she replied, "Hello, I'm Momo." The doll's lips moved again.
"I belong to you. All the other kids envy you because I am yours."
"You aren't mine," Momo said. "Someone must have left you here by mistake." She picked up the doll. Again the lips moved.
"I'd like some nice new things,"
said the metallic voice. "Would you?" Momo thought for a moment. "I doubt if I got anything you'd care for, but you're welcome to have a look." Still holding the doll, Momo clambered through the hole in the wall that led to her underground room. All her most treasured possessions were in a box beneath the bed. She pulled it out and lifted the lid. "Here," she said, "this is all I've got. If you like anything, just tell me." And she showed the doll a colorful bird's feather, a pebble with pretty streaks in it, a brass button, and a fragment of colored glass. The doll said nothing, so she nudged it.
"Hello, I'm Lola, the living doll."
"I know," said Momo, "but you told me you wanted something. How about this lovely pink seashell? Would you like it?"
"I belong to you. All the other kids envy you because I am yours."
"You told me that too," said Momo. "All right, if you don't want any of my things, perhaps we could play a game together, shall we?"
"I'd like some nice new things,"
the doll repeated. "I don't have anything else," Momo said. She took the doll and climbed back outside again. Then she put Lola, the living doll, on the ground and sat down facing her. "Let's pretend you've come to pay me a visit," Momo suggested.
"Hello, I'm Lola, the living doll."
"How nice of you to call," Momo replied politely. "Have you come far?"
"I belong to you. All the other kids envy you because I am yours."
"Look," said Momo, "we'll never get anywhere if you go on repeating yourself like this."
"I'd like some nice new things,"
said the doll, fluttering its eyelashes. Momo tried several games in turn, but nothing came of them. If only the doll had remained silent, she could have supplied the answers herself and held an interesting conversation with it. As it was, the very fact that it could talk made conversation impossible. Before long, Momo was overcome by a sensation so entirely new to her that she took quite a while to recognize it as a plain boredom. Although her inclination was to abandon Lola, the living doll, and play some other game, she couldn't for some reason tear herself away. So there she sat, gazing at the doll, and the doll, with its glassy blue eyes fixed on hers, gazed back. It was as if they had hypnotized each other. When, at long last, Momo did manage to drag her eyes away from the doll, she gave a little start of surprise. Parked close by, not that she had heard it drive up, stood a smart grey car. In it sat a man wearing a suit as grey as a spider's web, and a stiff rounded bowler hat of the same color. He was smoking a small grey cigar, and his face too was as grey as ashes. He must have been watching Momo for some time, because he nodded and smiled at her, and although the day was so hot that the air was dancing in the sunlight, Momo suddenly began to shiver. The man opened the car door and came over, carrying a steel grey briefcase. "What a lovely doll you have there," he said in a peculiar flat and expressionless voice. "It must be the envy of all your playmates." Momo just shrugged and said nothing. "I'll bet it cost a fortune," the man in grey went on. "I wouldn't know," Momo mumbled, feeling rather embarrassed. "I found it lying around." "Well, I never," said the man in grey. "You are a lucky girl, and no mistake." Momo remained silent and hugged her baggy jacket tightly to her. It was growing colder and colder. "All the same, you don't seem too pleased," said the man in grey with a thin-lipped smile. Momo shook her head. She suddenly felt as if happiness had fled the world forever, or rather as if happiness had never existed, and all her ideas of it had been merely figments of her own imagination. At the same time, she had a presentiment of danger. "I've been watching you for quite a while," pursued the man in grey. "From what I've seen, you don't have the first idea how to play with such a marvelous doll. Shall I show you?" Momo stared at him in surprise and nodded.
"I'd like some nice new things,"
the doll squawked suddenly. "You see," said the man in grey, "she's actually telling you herself. You can't play with a marvelous doll like this the way you'd play with any old doll, that's obvious. Anyway, it isn't what she's meant for you. If you don't want to get bored with her, you have to give her things. Look here." He went back to the car and opened the trunk. "In the first place," he said, "she needs plenty of clothes, like this gorgeous evening gown, for instance." He pulled out a gown and tossed it to Momo. "And here's a genuine mink coat, and a tennis dress, and a skiing outfit, and a swimsuit, and a riding habit, and some pyjamas, and a nightie, and another dress, and another, and another, and another." One by one, he tossed them over till they formed a huge heap on the ground between Momo and the doll. "There," he said with another thin-lipped smile, "that should keep you happy for a while, shouldn't it? Or are you going to get bored again after a couple of days? Very well, you'll just have to have some more nice things for your doll." And he reached inside the trunk again. "Here, for instance, is a real little snakeskin purse with a real little lipstick and powder compact inside. Here's a miniature camera and a tennis racket and a doll's TV set that really works. Here's a bracelet, a necklace, some earrings, a doll's gold-plated automatic, some silk stockings, a feather boa, a straw hat, an Easter bonnet, some miniature golf clubs, a little checkbook, perfume, bath salts, body lotion." He broke off and glanced keenly at Momo, who was sitting amid this clutter of toys with a stunned expression on her face. "You see," he said, "it's quite simple. As long as you go on getting more and more things, you'll never get bored. I know what you're going to say. Sooner or later Lola will have everything, and then I'll be bored again. Well, there's no fear of that. Here we have the perfect boyfriend for Lola." This time, when he reached into the trunk, he produced a boy doll. It was the same size as Lola and just as lifelike. "Look, this is Butch. He has any number of nice things too, and when you get bored with him, we can supply a girlfriend for Lola with masses of outfits that won't fit anyone but her. Butch has a friend too, and his friends have friends of his own, and so on ad infinitum. So you see, you never get bored because the game can go on forever. There's always something left to wish for. As he spoke, the man in grey took doll after doll from the trunk, whose contents seemed inexhaustible. Momo continued to sit there, watching him rather apprehensively, while he arrayed them on the ground beside her. "Well, now do you see how to play with dolls like these?" he said at length, expelling a dense cloud of smoke from his cigar. "Yes," said Momo, who was positively shaking with cold. Satisfied, the man in grey nodded and took another pull at his cigar. "You'd like to keep all these nice things, wouldn't you?" "Of course you would. Very well, I'll make you a present of them. You can have them, not all at once, of course, but one at a time, and lots of other things as well. You don't have to do anything in return. Just play with them the way I've shown you. What do you say?" He fixed Momo with an expectant smile. Then, when she still said nothing, just returned his gaze without smiling back, he went on quickly. "You won't need your friends any more, don't you see? You'll have quite enough to amuse you when all these lovely things are yours, and you keep on getting more, won't you? You'd like that, wouldn't you? Surely you want this marvelous doll. I'll bet you've already set your heart on it." Momo dimly sensed that she had a fight on her hands, indeed that she was already in the thick of the fray, but she didn't know why she was fighting, or with whom. The longer she listened to this stranger, the more she felt as she had felt with the doll. She could hear a voice speaking, and hear the words it uttered, but she couldn't tell who was actually saying them. She shook her head. "What?" exclaimed the man in grey, raising his eyebrows. "You modern children are never satisfied, honestly. Lola's perfect in every detail. If there's anything wrong with her, perhaps you'd care to tell me." Momo stared at the ground and thought hard. Then she said very quietly, "I don't think anyone could love it. Her, I mean." The man in grey didn't answer for some time. He stared into space with eye as glassy as the doll's. At last he pulled himself together. "That's not the point," he said coldly. Momo met his eyes. What scared her most about him was the icy chill that seemed to emanate from his body. Yet in some strange way, she couldn't have said why, she felt sorry for him as well as scared. "But I do love my friends," she said. The man in grey grimaced as if he'd bitten into a lemon, but he quickly recovered his composure and gave her a razor-sharp smile. "Momo, I think we should have a serious talk, you and I," he said smoothly. "It's time you learned what matters in life." He produced a little grey notebook from his pocket and leafed through it until he found what he was looking for. "Your name is Momo, isn't it?" Momo nodded. The man in grey shut his notebook with a snap and pocketed it again. Then, with a faint grunt of exertion, he sat himself down on the ground at Momo's side. He said no more for a while, just puffed thoroughly at his small grey cigar. "All right, Momo," he said at last. "Listen carefully." Momo had been trying to do this all the time, but the man in grey was far harder to listen to than anyone she'd ever heard. She could understand what other people meant and what they were like by getting right inside them, so to speak, but with him it was quite impossible. Whenever she tried to read his thoughts, she seemed to plunge headlong into a dark chasm as if there were nothing there at all. It had never ever happened to her before. All that matters in life, the man in grey went on, is to climb the ladder of success, amount to something, own things. When a person climbs higher than the rest, amounts to more, owns more things, everything else comes automatically. Friendship, love, respect, etc. You tell me you love your friends. Let's examine that statement quite objectively. He blew a few smoke rings. Momo tucked her bare feet under her skirt and burrowed still deeper into her oversized jacket. The first question to consider, pursued the man in grey, is how much your friends really gain from the fact of your existence. Are you any practical use to them? No. Do you help them to get on in the world, make more money, make something of their lives? No again. Do you assist them in their efforts to save time? On the contrary, you distract them. You're a millstone around their necks and an obstacle to their progress. You may not realize it, Momo, but you harm your friends by simply being there. Without meaning to be, you're really their enemy. Is that what you call love? Momo didn't know what to say. She'd never looked at things that way. She even wondered, for one brief moment, whether the man in grey might not be right after all. And that, he went on, is why we want to protect your friends from you. If you really love them, you'll help us. We have their interests at heart, so we want them to succeed in life. We can't just look on idly while you distract them from everything that matters. We want to make sure you leave them alone. That's why we're giving you all those lovely things. Momo's lips had begun to tremble. Who is we? She asked. The Time-Saving Bank, said the man in grey. I am agent number BLW553C. I wish you no harm, personally speaking, but the Time-Saving Bank isn't an organization to be trifled with. Just then, Momo recalled what Beppo and Guido had said about time-saving being infectious, and she had an awful suspicion that this stranger had something to do with the spread of the epidemic. She wished from the bottom of her heart that her friends were with her now. She had never felt so alone, but she was determined not to let fear get the better of her. Summoning up all her courage, she plunged headlong into the dark chasm in which the stranger concealed his true self. He had been watching her out of the corner of his eye, so the change in her expression did not escape him. He lit a fresh cigar from the butt of the old one. "Don't bother," he said with a sarcastic smile. "You are no match for us." But Momo stood firm. "Isn't there anyone who loves you?" she whispered. The man in grey squirmed a little. "I must say," he replied in his greyest voice, "I've never met anyone like you before. Truly, I haven't. And I've met a lot of people in my life. If there were many more like you around, we'd have nothing left to live on. we'd have to close down the time-saving bank and dissolve into thin air." He broke off, staring at Momo as if she were something he could neither understand nor cope with. His face turned a shade grayer. When next he spoke, it was as if he were doing so against his will, as if the words were pouring forth despite him. At the same time his face became more and more convulsed with horror at what was happening to him. At long last Momo heard his real voice, which seemed to come from very far away. "We have to remain unrecognized," he blurted out. "No one must know of our existence or activeness. We make sure no one ever remembers us, because we can only carry on our business if we pass unnoticed. It's a wearisome business too, bleeding people of their time by the hour, minute and second. All the time they save they lose to us. We drain it off, we hoard it, we thirst of it. Human beings have no conception of the value of their time, but we do. We suck them dry, and we need more and more time every day, because there are more and more of us, more and more, more and more." The last few words were uttered in a sort of death rattle. The man in grey clapped his hands over his mouth and stared at Momo with his eyes bulging. Little by little he seemed to emerge from a kind of trance. What happened?" he stammered. "You've been spying on me. I'm ill, and it's all your fault." His tone became almost imploring. "I've been talking nonsense, Momo. Forget it. Forget me like everyone else. You must. You must." He grabbed a hold of Momo and shook her. Her lips moved, but she couldn't get a word out. The man in grey jumped to his feet. He peered in all directions like a corned beast, then snatched up his briefcase and sprinted to the car. The next moment something very strange happened. Like an explosion in reverse, all the dolls and their scattered belongings flew back into the trunk, which slammed shut. The car roared off at such speed that grit and pebbles sported off from its wheels. Momo sat there for a long time, trying to make sense of what she had heard. As the dreadful chill seeped slowly from her limbs, so her thoughts became steadily clearer. Now that she had heard the real voice of the man in grey, she could remember everything. From the sun-baked grass in front of her rose a slender thread of smoke. The trampled butt of a small grey cigar was smouldering away to ashes. Chapter 8. The Demonstration. Late that afternoon, Guido and Beppo turned up. They found Momo sitting in the shade of a wall, still rather pale and upset, so they sat down beside her and anxiously inquired what the matter was. Momo began to tell them what had happened, haltingly at first, but she ended by repeating her entire conversation with the man in grey, word for word. Old Beppo watched her gravely and intently throughout, the furrows in his wrinkled brow growing deeper by the minute. He said nothing, even when she had finished. Guido, by contrast, listened to her with mounting excitement. His eyes began to shine, as they so often did when he himself was telling a story and got carried away. He gripped Momo by the shoulder. "Well," he said, "this is our big moment. You've discovered something no one else knew. Now we can rescue everyone from their clutches. Not just our friends, but the whole city. It's up to the three of us, you, me, and Beppo." He jumped up, and stood there with his arms flung out. In his mind's eye he could see a vast crowd of people hailing him as the savior. "Yes," said Momo, looking rather baffled, "but how?" "What do you mean, how?" Guido demanded irritably. "I mean," said Momo, "how do we beat the men in grey at their own game?" Guido shrugged. "I can't say exactly, of course, not right this minute. We'll have to work something out first. But one thing's for sure. Now we know they exist and what they're up to. We must tackle them. Or are you scared?" Momo nodded uneasily. "I don't think they're ordinary men. The one that was here looked different somehow, and the air around him was dreadfully cold. If there are a lot of them, they're bound to be dangerous. Yes, I'm scared." "Don't be silly," Guido said briskly. "The whole thing's quite simple. They can only do their dirty work as long as nobody recognizes them. Your visitor said so himself. Well then, all we have to do is make sure they're recognizable. Once people recognize them, they remember them. And once they remember them, they'll know them again at a glance. The man in grey won't be able to harm us then. We'll be safe as houses." "You really think so?" Momo said rather doubtfully. Guido's eyes were shining with confidence. "Of course," he assured her. "Why else would your visitor have taken to his heels like that? They're terrified of us, I tell you." "What if we can't find them?" Momo asked. "They may go and hide." "They may well," Guido conceded. "If they do, we'll simply have to lure them out into the open." "But how?" asked Momo. "They're pretty clever, it seems to me." "That's easy," Guido said with a chuckle. "We'll take advantage of their own greed. If you can catch mice with cheese, you can catch time thieves with time. And that's what we've got plenty of. For instance, Beppo and I could lie in and wait while you sat here twiddling your thumbs. When they took the bait, we'd jump out and overpower them." "But they already know me," Momo objected. "I don't think they'd fall for it." "All right," said Guido, who was brimming over with bright ideas. "Then we'll try something else. Your man in grey mentioned something about a time-saving bank. That means it's a building somewhere in town. All we have to do is find it. And find it we will, because it's bound to be a very special-looking place. I can see it now, grey, sinister, and windowless, like a gigantic concrete safe. Once we find it, we'll walk straight in. We'll all be armed with pistols, one in each hand. You, I'll say, hand over the time you've stolen and make it snappy. And they'll—" "But we don't have any pistols," Momo broke in anxiously. Guido grandly dismissed this objection. "Then we'll do it unarmed. That'll impress them even more. They'll panic at the very sight of us." "It might be better if there were a few more of us," Momo said. "I mean, we'd probably find the time-saving bank quicker if other people went looking for it as well." "That's a good idea," said Guido. "We must mobilize all our friends, and all the kids who spend so much time here nowadays. I vote we get started right away, the 3 of us. Tell as many people as you can find, and tell them to pass the word. We'll all meet up here at 3 tomorrow afternoon for a grand council of war." So they all set off at once, Momo in one direction, Beppo and Guido in another. The 2 men had gone some distance when Beppo, who still hadn't spoken, came to a sudden stop. "Know something, Guido?" he said. "I am worried." Guido turned to look at him. "About what?" Beppo regarded his friend in silence for a moment. Then he said, "I believe Momo." "So do I," said Guido, puzzled. What of it? I mean, Bepo went on, I believe that what she told us is true. Guido couldn't understand what the old man was getting at. Of course, he said. So what? Well, said Bepo, if it is true what she told us, we shouldn't rush into anything. We don't want to tangle with a bunch of crooks just like that, do we? If we provoke them, it may land Momo in trouble. I don't mind so much about us, but we may endanger the children if we bring them into it too. We must think very carefully before we act. Guido threw back his head and laughed. You and your eternal worrying, he scoffed. The more of us there are, the better. That's obvious. From the sound of it, Bepo said gravely, you don't believe that Momo's story was true at all. Depends what you mean by true, Guido retorted. You have no imagination. That's your trouble. The whole world's one big story, and we are all part of it. Sure, I believe what Momo told us, Bepo, every word of it, just like you. Bepo could not find a suitable response to this, but Guido's optimism did nothing to allay his fears. They then parted company, Guido with a light heart, Bepo filled with foreboding, and went off to spread the news of tomorrow's meeting. That night, Guido dreamed he was being feted as one of the city's saviors. He saw himself in a dress suit, Bepo in a smart tailcoat and Momo in a snow-white silk gown. The mayor draped gold chains around their necks and crowned them with laurel wreaths. Stirring music rang out, and the citizens honored their deliverers with a torchlight procession longer and more impressive than any that had ever been seen before. Meanwhile, old Bepo was tossing and turning, unable to sleep. The more he thought about what laid ahead, the more clearly he perceived its dangers. He wouldn't let Guido and Momo brave them alone. He would stand by them whatever happened. That went without saying, but he must at least attempt to dissuade them. By 3 the next afternoon, the amphitheater resounded to excited cries and the hum of many voices. Although it saddened Momo that none of her grown-up friends had appeared, except of course for Bepo and Guido, some 50 or 60 children had come from near and far. They were all shapes and sizes, rich and poor, well-behaved and rowdy. Some, like Maria, were holding younger members of the family by the hand or in their arms. Tiny little children who sucked their thumbs and gazed wide-eyed at the unusual gathering. Franco, Paolo, and Massimo were there too, naturally, but most of the other children were relative newcomers to the amphitheater, and they had a special interest in the subject under discussion. Among them was the owner of the transistor radio, who had turned up without it. Seating himself next to Momo, he told her straight away that his name was Claudio, and that he was glad to have been invited. When it became clear that the last of the children had arrived, Guido rose to his feet and with a sweeping gesture called for silence. The buzz of conversation died away, and an expectant hush descended on the amphitheater. "My friends," Guido began, "you all have a rough idea why we're here. You were told when you received your invitations to this secret meeting. More and more people are finding themselves with less and less time to spare, even though they're saving it for all they're worth. The truth is, they've lost the very time they meant to save. Why? We know now, thanks to Momo. People are being robbed of their time, and I mean robbed by a gang of time thieves. That's why we need your help, so as to put a stop to the activities of this cold-blooded criminal fraternity. Our city is in the grip of a nightmare. With your cooperation, we can banish it at a stroke. Isn't that a cause worth fighting for?" He paused while the children applauded. "We will discuss what to do in due course," he went on. "Meantime, Momo is going to describe her encounter with a member of the gang and how he gave himself away." "One moment," said Beppo, getting up. "Listen, children. I say Momo shouldn't tell you her story. It's a bad idea. If she does, she'll endanger herself and all of you." "No," cried several voices. "Let her speak. We want Momo." More and more voices joined in until all the children were chanting "Momo, Momo, Momo" in unison. Old Beppo sat down again. He took off his little steel-rimmed spectacles and wearily rubbed his eyes. Momo stood up, looking perplexed. She didn't know whose wishes to comply with, Beppo's or the children's. At length, while her audience listened attentively, she recounted what had happened. A long silence fell when she finished. The children had grown rather uneasy during her speech. They hadn't imagined that time thieves could be so sinister. One tiny tot burst into tears, but was quickly comforted. The silence was broken by Guido. "Well," he said, "how many of you have the guts to join our campaign against the man in grey?" "Why didn't Beppo want Momo to tell us what happened?" Franco inquired. Guido gave him a reassuring smile. "He thinks the time thieves feel threatened by those who know their secret, so they try to hunt them down. Myself, I think it's the other way around. I'm convinced that knowing their secret makes a person invulnerable. Once you know it, they can't lay a finger on you. That's logical, wouldn't you say? Come on, Beppo, admit it." But Beppo only shook his head, and the children remained silent. "One thing is certain, anyway," Guido pursued. "From now on, we must stick together, come hell or high water. We've got to be careful, but we mustn't get scared. All right, I'll ask you again. Who's prepared to join us?" "I am," said Claudio, getting to his feet. He looked a trifle pale. Others followed suit, hesitantly at first, then more and more resolutely, until everyone present had volunteered. "Well, Beppo," said Guido, pointing to the forest of raised hands, "what do you say now?" Beppo nodded sadly. "I'm with you too, of course." "Good." Guido turned back to the children. "So now let's decide what to do. Any suggestions?" They all thought hard. Paolo, the boy with glasses, finally said, "But how do they do it? I mean, can they really steal time?" "Yes, what is time anyway?" Claudio chimed in. No one could supply an answer. Maria, with little Rosa in her arms, got up from her seat on the far side of the arena. "Maybe it's like electricity," she hazarded. "After all, there are machines that can record people's thought waves. I've seen one myself on TV. They've got gadgets that can do anything these days." "How about this for an idea?" squeaked Massimo, the fat boy with the high-pitched voice. "When you photograph something, it's down on film. When you record something, it's down on tape. Maybe they've got a machine that can record time. If we knew where it was, we could simply put it into reverse and the missing time would be there again." "Anyway," said Paolo, adjusting his glasses, "the first thing to do is find a scientist to help us. We won't get anywhere without one." "You and your scientists," sneered Franco. "Who says they can be trusted? Suppose we find one who was an expert on time. How could we be sure he wasn't in league with the time thieves? Then we'd really be up the creek." Everyone seemed impressed by this objection. The next person to speak up was a little girl of demure and ladylike appearance. "If you ask me," she said, "our best plan would be to go to the police and tell them the whole story." "Now I've heard everything," Franco scoffed. "What would the policemen do? These aren't just ordinary thieves. Either the cops have known about them all along, in which case they must be powerless, or they haven't noticed a thing, in which case they'd never believe us." A baffled silence ensued. "Well," Paolo said eventually, "we've got to do something, as soon as possible too, before the time thieves get wind of what we are up to." Guido rose to his feet again. "My friends," he said, "I've already given this matter a lot of thought. After dreaming up hundreds of schemes and rejecting them all in turn, I finally hit one that's guaranteed to do the trick, as long as you all cooperate. I merely wanted to see if one of you could come up with a better idea. Well, now I tell you what we're going to do." He paused and looked slowly around the amphitheater. He was ringed by 50 or 60 expectant faces, the biggest audience he had in a long time. "As you are now aware," he went on, "the men in grey depend for their power on being able to work unrecognized and in secret. It follows that the simplest and most effective way of rendering them harmless is to broadcast the truth about them. And how are we to do that? I'll tell you. We're going to hold a mass demonstration. We're going to paint posters and banners and march through the streets with them. We're going to attract as much attention as possible. We're going to invite the whole city to join us here at the old amphitheater to hear the full facts." A stir ran through the listening children. "Everyone will go wild with excitement," Guido continued. "Thousands and thousands of people will come flocking in. Then, when a vast crowd has assembled, we'll reveal the whole terrible truth. And then, my friends, the world will change overnight. No one will be able to steal people's time anymore. They all have as much as they need, because there will be enough to go around again. That's what we can achieve if we all work together, if we're all in favor. Are we?" This drew a chorus of exultant yells. "Carried unanimously," said Guido. "In that case, we'll invite the whole city here next Sunday afternoon. Till then, though, we mustn't breathe a word of our plan. And now, let's get to work." For the next few days, the amphitheater hummed with furtive but feverish activity. Sheets of paper, pots of paint, brushes, paste, cardboards, poles, planks, and a host of other essentials appeared like magic. Where from, the children preferred not to say. Some of them made banners and posters and placards, while others, the ones that were good at writing, thought up catchy slogans and painted them in their neatest lettering. At last, when all was ready, the children assembled in the amphitheater and set off in a single file with Guido, Beppo, and Momo at their head. They marched through the streets, brandishing posters and banners, clattering saucepan lids, blowing penny whistles, chanting slogans, and singing a song composed especially for the occasion by Guido. The words went as follows. "Listen, folk, here is it too late, or you'll live to rue your fate. Time is flying every day, stolen by the man in grey. Listen, folk, and heed our warning, all you wake up one fine morning, robbed of time and quite bereft, another single minute left. Don't save time, then save your city, for those time thieves have no pity. Fight back hard, and do it soon. Be there Sunday afternoon. Actually, there were more verses than that, 28 to be exact, but we needn't quote them all here. Although the police stepped in a few times and broke up the procession when it obstructed the traffic, the children were undeterred. They simply formed up elsewhere and set off again. Nothing happened apart from this, and they didn't scythe a single man in grey for all their vigilance. They were, however, joined by other children who saw the demonstration and hadn't known of the affair until now. More and more youngsters tagged along until the streets were filled with hundreds or even thousands of them, all urging their elders to attend the meeting that was to change the world. Chapter 9. The Trial. The great moment had come and gone. It was over, and not a single grown-up had appeared. The children's demonstration had passed almost unnoticed by the very people it was aimed at. All their efforts had been in vain. The big red sun was already sinking into a sea of purple clouds, so low in the sky that its rays lit only the topmost tiers of steps in the amphitheatre, where so many hundreds of children had been waiting for so long. No cheerful hum of voices broke the sad and disconsolate silence. The shadows were lengthening fast. It would soon be dark, and the children began to shiver in the chill evening air. Somewhere in the distance a church clock struck 8. Doubt gave way to certainty. The whole scheme had been a complete fiasco. 1 or 2 children got up and drifted off. Others followed suit. None of them said a word. Their disappointment was too great. Eventually Paolo came over to Momo and said, "It is no use waiting any longer. No one will turn up now. Good night." And he walked off too. Franco was the next to leave. "It's hopeless," he said. "We can't count on the grown-ups. We know that now. I never did trust them anyway. As far as I'm concerned, they can stew in their own juice from now on." More and more children left. It was dark by the time the last of them gave up and went home, leaving Momo alone with Guido and Beppo. The old road sweeper stood up. "Are you going too?" Momo asked. "I've got to go," Beppo told her with a sigh. "I'm on night duty." "Night duty?" "Yes, unloading garbage at the municipal dump. I'm due there in half an hour." "But it's Sunday. Besides, you've never had to do that before." "No, but we've been told to report there. They say it's only temporary. There's too much garbage to handle, apparently, shortage of staff and so on." "What a shame," said Momo. "I'd have liked you to stay a while." "Yes, I don't want to go myself, but there it is. I've got to go." And Beppo mounted his squeaky old bicycle and pedaled off into the darkness. Guido was whistling a soft and melancholy tune. He could whistle very sweetly, and Momo was listening with pleasure when he suddenly broke off. "Heavens!" he exclaimed. "I must go too. Today's when I start my new job, night watchman. Didn't I tell you? I'd forgotten the time." Momo just stared at him and said nothing. "So your plan didn't work out," he went on. "Never mind, Momo. It didn't work out the way I hoped, either, but it was fun all the same. Tremendous fun." When Momo still said nothing, he stroked her hair soothingly and added, "Don't take it so hard, Momo. Everything will look quite different in the morning. We'll just have to come up with a new idea, a new game." "It wasn't a game," Momo said in a muffled voice. Guido stood up. "Look, I know how you feel, but we'll talk about it tomorrow, okay? I have to go now. I'm late enough as it is. Anyway, it's time you went to bed. And he walked off whistling his melancholy tune. So Momo remained sitting forlornly in the great stone bowl of the amphitheatre. Clouds had veiled the sky and blotted out the stars. A peculiar breeze had sprung up, light but persistent and singularly cold. If breezes can be said to have a color, this one was grey. Far away, beyond the outskirts of the city, loomed the massive municipal garbage dump. It was a veritable mountain of ash, cinders, broken glass and china, tin cans, plastic containers, old mattresses, cardboard cartons, and countless other objects discarded by the city's inhabitants, all waiting to be fed, bit by bit, into huge incinerators. Beppo and his workmates toiled for hours, shoveling garbage out of a long line of trucks. The trucks crept forward, headlights blazing, but the more they emptied, the longer the line became. "Faster!" the foreman kept shouting. "Hurry up, or we'll never be finished." They didn't finish the job until midnight, by which time Beppo's shirt was clinging to his back. Being older than the rest, and not the most robust of men, he flopped down wearily on an upturned plastic bucket and struggled to get his breath back. "Hey, Beppo," one of his workmates called. "We're off home now. Coming?" "In a minute," wheezed Beppo. He clasped one hand to his aching chest. "Feelin' all right, old man?" called someone else. "I'm fine," Beppo called back. "Just taking a little breather, that's all. Don't wait for me." "Okay," said the others. "Good night," and off they went. It was quiet when they'd gone, except for an occasional rustle and squeak from rats scrabbling in the garbage. Beppo pillowed his head on his folded arms and dozed off. He didn't know how long he'd been asleep when he was roused by a gust of cold air. One look was enough to jolt him awake in an instant. All over the huge mound of garbage stood grey figures, attired in smart grey suits and grey bowler hats, steel grey briefcases in their hands, and small grey cigars in their mouths. They were gazing fixedly, silently at the summit of the mound. There, esconded on a sort of magistrate's bench, sat three men identical to the others in every aspect. Beppo was frightened for a moment. He had no business to be there. He sensed that instinctively, and the prospect of discovery scared him. Very soon, however, he realized that the army of grey figures had eyes for no one but the three-man tribunal. Either they had failed to notice him at all, or they had mistaken him for some discarded object. Whatever the explanation, he resolved to keep as still as a mouse. Then the silence was broken by a voice from the judge's bench. "The Supreme Court is now in session," announced the central figure. "Call agent number BLW 553C. The cry was repeated further down the slope and repeated again some distance away, like an echo. Threading his way slowly through the crowd and up the mound of garbage came a man in grey, distinguishable from his fellows only by the pallor of his face, which was almost white. At last he reached the tribunal. "Are you agent number BLW 553C? asked the man in the center. "I am." "How long have you been employed by the time-saving bank?" "Ever since I came to existence, Your Honor." "That goes without saying. Kindly spare us such irrelevancies. when did you come to existence? 11 years, 3 months, 6 days, 8 hours, 32 minutes, and at this precise moment, 18 seconds ago. Oddly enough, although this exchange was being conducted far away and in low, monotonous voices, Beppo didn't miss a word of it. Are you aware, the man in the center went on, that a substantial number of children paraded through the streets today with placards and banners, and that they even entertained the outrageous notion of inviting the whole city to attend a briefing on our activities? It hadn't escaped me, replied the agent. How do you account for the fact that these children knew about us and our activities? The senior inquisitor pursued remorselessly. It is a mystery to me, Your Honor, said the agent. If I may venture a personal observation, however, I would urge the Supreme Court not to take this incident more seriously than it deserves. It was a piece of childish nonsense, that's all. I would also urge the court to bear in mind that we easily managed to scoot the scheduled meeting by leaving people no time to attend it. Even had we failed to do so, however, I am convinced that everyone would have dismissed the children's information as a cock-and-bull story. In my opinion, we would have done better to let the meeting go ahead, because that would— Defendant, the judge broke in sharply, do you realize where you are? Yes, he whispered. This is no human court, the judge continued. You are being tried by your own kind. Lying to us is futile. You know that perfectly well, so why bother to try? It's an occupational habit, the agent stammered. It is for this court to decide how seriously to take the children's intentions. However, I need hardly remind you that children present are greater threat to our work than anyone or anything else. I know, the agent conceded meekly. Children are our natural enemies, but for them, mankind would have been completely in our power long ago. Adults are far easier to turn into time savers. That's why one of our most sacred commandments states, leave the children till last. Are you familiar with that commandment, defendant? Yes, indeed, Your Honor, said the agent, puffing hard at his cigar. It was a peculiar fact that despite the solemnity of the occasion, all present judges, defendant and spectators were smoking incessantly. And yet, the judge retorted, we have incontrovertible proof that one of us, I repeat, that one of us not only got into conversation with a child, but betrayed us. Do you happen to know who that certain person was? Agent number BLW553C wilted still more. It was me, Your Honor. And why did you break our most sacred commandment? Because the child in question has been seriously impeding our work by turning people against us. I had the interest of the time-saving bank at heart. My intentions were of the best. Your intentions don't concern us. Results are all that count here, and the result of your unauthorized action has been to gain us no time and acquaint a child with some of our most vital secrets. Do you admit that? The agent hung his head. I do, he whispered. So you plead guilty? Yes, Your Honor, but I would like to draw the court's attention to an extenuating circumstance. I was genuinely bewitched. lured into betraying us by the way the child listened to me. I can't explain how it happened, but I swear that's the way it was." "Your excuses are irrelevant and immaterial. This court takes no account of extenuating circumstances. The law is quite categorical on this point and allows of no exceptions. However, we shall certainly devote some attention to this unusual child. What is his name?" "Momo, Your Honor." "Male or female?" "She's a girl." "Place of residence?" "The ruined amphitheater." "Very well," said the judge, who had recorded all these details in his notebook. "You may rest assured, defendant, that this child will never harm us again. We shall neutralize her by every available means. Let that thought console you, now that sentence is about to be passed and carried out." The agent began to tremble. "What is the sentence?" he whispered. The three judges put their heads together and conferred in an undertone. Then they nodded, and their spokesman turned to face the prisoner again. "Agent number BLW553C, having pleaded guilty to a charge of high treason, this court unanimously sentence him to pay the penalty prescribed by law. He is to be deprived of all time forthwith." "Mercy! Mercy!" shrieked the agent, but his steel-grey briefcase and small cigar had already been snatched away by two grey figures standing beside him. And then a very strange thing happened. No sooner had the condemned man lost his cigar than he started to become more and more transparent. His screams grew fainter too, as he stood there with his head in his hands, dissolving into thin air. The last that could be seen of him was a little flurry of ash dying in the breeze, but that soon vanished too. Silently, the man in grey dispersed, judges and spectators alike. Once the darkness had swallowed them up, the sole reminder of their presence was a chill grey wind that swirled around the dismal and deserted garbage dump. Beppo continued to sit spellbound on his upturned bucket, staring at the spot where the condemned man had been standing. He felt as if his limbs had turned to ice and were only just beginning to thaw. The man in grey existed. He had seen them for himself. At about the same time, the distant church clock had already struck 12. Momo was still sitting on the steps of the amphitheater. She was waiting. For what, she didn't know, but some instinct had dissuaded her from going to bed. All of a sudden, something lightly brushed against her bare feet. Peering hard, for it was very dark, she saw a big tortoise looking up at her. Its mouth seemed to curve in a mysterious smile, and there was such a friendly light in its shrewd black eyes that Momo felt it was about to speak. She bent down and tickled it under the chin. "Who might you be?" she said softly. "Nice of you to come and keep me company, tortoise, even if nobody else will. What can I do for you?" Momo wasn't sure whether she'd failed to notice them before, or whether they only just appeared, but she suddenly spotted some letters on the tortoise's back. They were faintly luminous and seemed to follow the natural patterns on its shell. "Follow me," she slowly deciphered. Astonished, she sat up with a jerk. "Do you mean me?" she asked. But the tortoise had already set off. After a few steps it paused and looked back. "It really does mean me," Momo said to herself. She got up and went over to the creature. "Keep going," she told it softly. "I'm right behind you." And step by step she followed the tortoise as it slowly, very slowly, led her out of the amphitheater and headed out for the city. Chapter 9. The Trial. The great moment had come and gone. It was over, and not a single grown-up had appeared. The children's demonstration had passed almost unnoticed by the very people it was aimed at. All their efforts had been in vain. The big red sun was already sinking into a sea of purple clouds, so low in the sky that its rays lit only the topmost tiers of steps in the amphitheater where so many hundreds of children had been waiting for so long. No cheerful hum of voices broke the sad and disconsolate silence. The shadows were lengthening fast. It would soon be dark, and the children began to shiver in the chill evening air. Somewhere in the distance a church clock struck 8. Doubt gave way to certainty. The whole scheme had been a complete fiasco. 1 or 2 children got up and drifted off. Others followed suit. None of them said a word. Their disappointment was too great. Eventually Paolo came over to Momo and said, "It is no use waiting any longer. No one will turn up now. Good night." And he walked off too. Franco was the next to leave. "It's hopeless," he said. "We can't count on the grown-ups. We know that now. I never did trust them anyway. As far as I'm concerned, they can stew in their own juice from now on." More and more children left. It was dark by the time the last of them gave up and went home, leaving Momo alone with Guido and Beppo. The old road sweeper stood up. "Are you going too?" Momo asked. "I've got to go," Beppo told her with a sigh. "I'm on night duty." "Night duty?" "Yes, unloading garbage at the municipal dump. I'm due there in half an hour." "But it's Sunday. Besides, you've never had to do that before." "No, but we've been told to report there. They say it's only temporary. There's too much garbage to handle, apparently, shortage of staff and so on." "What a shame," said Momo. "I'd have liked you to stay a while." "Yes, I don't want to go myself, but there it is. I've got to go." And Beppo mounted his squeaky old bicycle and pedaled off into the darkness. Guido was whistling a soft and melancholy tune. He could whistle very sweetly, and Momo was listening with pleasure when he suddenly broke off. "Heavens!" he exclaimed. "I must go too. Today's when I start my new job, night watchman. Didn't I tell you? I'd forgotten the time." Momo just stared at him and said nothing. "So your plan didn't work out," he went on. "Never mind, Momo. It didn't work out the way I hoped, either, but it was fun all the same. Tremendous fun." When Momo still said nothing, he stroked her hair soothingly and added, "Don't take it so hard, Momo. Everything will look quite different in the morning. We'll just have to come up with a new idea, a new game." "It wasn't a game," Momo said in a muffled voice. Guido stood up. "Look, I know how you feel, but we'll talk about it tomorrow, okay? I have to go now. I'm late enough as it is. Anyway, it's time you went to bed." And he walked off whistling his melancholy tune. So Momo remained sitting forlornly in the great stone bowl of the amphitheater. Clouds had veiled the sky and blotted out the stars. A peculiar breeze had sprung up, light but persistent and singularly cold. If breezes can be said to have a color, this one was grey. Far away, beyond the outskirts of the city, loomed the massive municipal garbage dump. It was a veritable mountain of ash, cinders, broken glass and china, tin cans, plastic containers, old mattresses, cardboard cartons, and countless other objects discarded by the city's inhabitants, all waiting to be fed, bit by bit, into huge incinerators. Beppo and his workmates toiled for hours, shoveling garbage out of a long line of trucks. The trucks crept forward, headlights blazing, but the more they emptied, the longer the line became. "Faster!" the foreman kept shouting. "Hurry up, or we'll never be finished." They didn't finish the job until midnight, by which time Beppo's shirt was clinging to his back. Being older than the rest, and not the most robust of men, he flopped down wearily on an upturned plastic bucket and struggled to get his breath back. "Hey, Beppo," one of his workmates called. "We're off home now. Coming?" "In a minute," wheezed Beppo. He clasped one hand to his aching chest. "Feelin' all right, old man?" called someone else. "I'm fine," Beppo called back. "Just taking a little breather, that's all. Don't wait for me." "Okay," said the others. "Good night," and off they went. It was quiet when they'd gone, except for an occasional rustle and squeak from rats scrabbling in the garbage. Beppo pillowed his head on his folded arms and dozed off. He didn't know how long he'd been asleep when he was roused by a gust of cold air. One look was enough to jolt him awake in an instant. All over the huge mound of garbage stood grey figures, attired in smart grey suits and grey bowler hats, steel grey briefcases in their hands, and small grey cigars in their mouths. They were gazing fixedly, silently at the summit of the mound. There, ensconced on a sort of magistrate's bench, sat 3 men identical to the others in every aspect. Beppo was frightened for a moment. He had no business to be there. He sensed that instinctively, and the prospect of discovery scared him. Very soon, however, he realized that the army of grey figures had eyes for no one but the 3-man tribunal. Either they had failed to notice him at all, or they had mistaken him for some discarded object. Whatever the explanation, he resolved to keep as still as a mouse. Then the silence was broken by a voice from the judge's bench. "The Supreme Court is now in session," announced the central figure. "Call agent number BLW 553C." The cry was repeated further down the slope and repeated again some distance away, like an echo. Threading his way slowly through the crowd and up the mound of garbage came a man in grey, distinguishable from his fellows only by the pallor of his face, which was almost white. At last he reached the tribunal. "Are you agent number BLW 553C?" asked the man in the center. "I am." "How long have you been employed by the time-saving bank?" "Ever since I came to existence, Your Honor." "That goes without saying. Kindly spare us such irrelevancies. When did you come to existence?" 11 years, 3 months, 6 days, 8 hours, 32 minutes, and at this precise moment, 18 seconds ago." Oddly enough, although this exchange was being conducted far away and in low, monotonous voices, Beppo didn't miss a word of it. "Are you aware," the man in the center went on, "that a substantial number of children paraded through the streets today with placards and banners, and that they even entertained the outrageous notion of inviting the whole city to attend a briefing on our activities?" "It hadn't escaped me," replied the agent. How do you account for the fact that these children knew about us and our activities? The senior inquisitor pursued remorselessly. It is a mystery to me, Your Honor, said the agent. If I may venture a personal observation, however, I would urge the Supreme Court not to take this incident more seriously than it deserves. It was a piece of childish nonsense, that's all. I would also urge the court to bear in mind that we easily managed to scoot the scheduled meeting by leaving people no time to attend it. Even had we failed to do so, however, I am convinced that everyone would have dismissed the children's information as a cock-and-bull story. In my opinion, we would have done better to let the meeting go ahead, because that would— Defendant, the judge broke in sharply, do you realize where you are? Yes, he whispered. This is no human court, the judge continued. You are being tried by your own kind. Lying to us is futile. You know that perfectly well, so why bother to try? It's an occupational habit, the agent stammered. It is for this court to decide how seriously to take the children's intentions. However, I need hardly remind you that children present are a greater threat to our work than anyone or anything else. I know, the agent conceded meekly. Children are our natural enemies, but for them, mankind would have been completely in our power long ago. Adults are far easier to turn into time savers. That's why one of our most sacred commandments states, leave the children till last. Are you familiar with that commandment, defendant?